And we are live with our 106th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, one thing that seems to constantly come up in every code review course that we talk about, and even every code review that I perform. I see a lot of problems with it. So we're super excited to have Justin Massey with us today from Datadog to talk about application logging and where it fits. Before we jump into that, a couple of items. Ken and I are currently doing the training for OWASP Global. There's some questions as to what that format actually looks like and whether that's actually going to happen in a virtual world, but watch out for notifications on that. Just watch either our Twitter feeds or at Absolute AppSec, and we'll let you know about that. We're also we are doing Black Hat Europe training as well, the more offensive version of the code review course. Outside of that, I don't think there's really any other announcements today. We are working on a follow-up to Midsummer Nights Con to watch this space for that as well. Sometime in the winter, there'll be another small virtual conference going on. Anyway, Ken, anything else I'm forgetting? I know we're kind of jumping straight into it today. So,
no, I think you've got everything. I think you remembered everything. So
okay. If my brain is working, yeah. What were you gonna say, Ken? Go for it.
Well, I mean, if your brain's not working, then definitely mine's not. I promise. So, if you forget something, I'm definitely gonna forget something. I promise you that. Anyway, so today we've got Justin with us. So Justin actually works on. He's a product manager. It's a product manager of security monitoring at Datadog. There was a blog post. I'm going to link it here that it was in Clint's TLDRsec newsletter that Justin had written. Let's see here. Post that. And I really we really want to talk to Justin because Seth alluded to it in our course. Monitoring comes up a lot. In fact, just yesterday, I got a response back from an assessment I was doing where, we kind of hit on monitoring. It was like a lengthy pull request, and there were like a few things, but one of the important bits was like, how are we handling exceptions? Make sure, since we're using a certain service, not to go put things out there that we don't want. And it always is part of these reviews, exception handling and not just that, but just monitoring of your data in general, and what security metrics and events you can get out of it are always important. And anyways, that's basically why we wanted Justin here. So thank you, Justin. And just real quick, Justin's background is heavy on he's been a security engineer, he's been a penetration tester, he's worked on, so he's both a security person and a developer kind of background. So just really happy to have Justin here to talk a little bit more about that. So Justin, can you say hello and tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I started working in IT, managed service provider kind of work. Worked in that for about 4 years, but the third year I got a knock on the door from the FBI, and they said another government agency had hacked into one of our customer servers, and it ended up being APT1. So that was my foray into defensive security. And I was like, I really want to learn how the Chinese got in. So I actually switched to penetration testing. Then I quickly learned that I didn't necessarily, I wasn't cut out for consulting. I wanted to work with the developers and getting the code fixed. So I switched to application security. And then ultimately, after many years in application security, I have now switched to product security, where we have developed a threat detection product that looks at all sorts of different event data. So that's that was kind of the way I ended up in a product role. moving from IT to penetration testing to AppSec to now product.
Awesome. Yeah, you have the exact background. I think that at least, well, no background's always the same, but like you have a background that kind of meshes with a lot of, I guess in AppSec, it's more prevalent to be have done both development and security. I think that's not super uncommon. When it comes to like monitoring and data monitoring, I think that's where I definitely have a lot of interest. Basically, let's kind of start off with talking about what things you might not be monitoring. Like, I figure we can jump right into it. Like things that you should be monitoring, things you shouldn't.
Well, and this is the number one question that we get, right? Is we're looking at code, we start talking about auditing and logging. And the students, the first thing out of their mouths is, well, we want a list. Like they want this checklist of what should we be monitoring. I know it's very situational, and it's very dependent on what the application is and what security. Like we always have this discussion, but let's just pose that question to you, Justin. Right, like where you've been involved with it for a while now. What is your go-to? Where do you start with application logging? And then we can go from there.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at like one of the most sensitive parts of an application from a security perspective is typically authentication.
Yes.
So if you screw up authentication, that's not good. Well, let's not screw up logging either. So things like asking yourself, the who, what, where, when, why questions. Like, who logged in, from where, when did they log in? Why you can't always answer why someone successfully logged in, but if someone failed to log in, was it because they failed to log in because their username was incorrect, it didn't match in the database, or they logged in with an incorrect password, or maybe their OAuth token expired? Like why did this thing fail? So beginning to kind of look at and frame those questions of like who, what, where, when, why about that authentication event, and then spreading out more broadly across your entire application. If you look at if you take a large cloud provider like AWS, who gives you access to all of your logs, kind of look at it like from a control plane perspective, where what activities are going on in your application that should be logged, and then start asking those who, what, where, when, whys about that, and then make sure those are in your logs. I think that's a really good place to start.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got authentication, and I know this is one thing that we like, the way that we structure like our activities around assessments like penetration testing and code review, right? We always talk about AAA, authentication, authorization, auditing, and then like the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability triads. That's like security kind of in a nutshell when we're looking at an application. And so like it sounds like you're what I'm hearing is you're saying anything that has to do with authentication or kind of those triads is what we should be looking at. Right? Do you have any techniques? I know Datadog is this huge platform, right? You guys suck in all of this data and then you distill it down from a security monitoring perspective. At least this is what I assume that you're doing on the back end, right? But what are your strategies for identifying what's important and what's not? That always becomes a huge issue with the number of logs that you get and the amount of data that you just consume out of applications. And then you talk about AWS, right? The amount of stuff that it spits at you, it can be crazy.
Yeah, I think you have to look at thinking about like what's most important to you and like what events should never happen, and start with monitoring those sort of events, right? Anomaly detection is really hard. It's a hard problem to solve. So if you're just starting out, I don't suggest you go to the AI ML approach. Let's solve some very basic things. One basic thing for your in AWS you may look for, or any cloud provider or anything, would be, did you just log in with root credentials without two-factor authentication? Now let's take a step back and look at your application logs for your custom application. Are there customers that should be logging in with two-factor authentication? Should all of your internal users be logging in with two-factor authentication? Let's find these rare events that should never happen. They're going to happen sometimes, and let's monitor for those, because those are they're like stepping stones. Like, let's make sure that we're monitoring for things that are easily understandable and explainable first. Because if you don't do that, then it's going to be really hard to take that next leap into where everyone loves to talk about, but I haven't seen a lot of great, practical use cases, actual good implementation for those use cases.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I like the approach of stepping stones, right? The small, like distill it down to something that you can understand, that is that would be a threat. So threat modeling is always one of those things that comes up in the course. We do kind of a mini threat model when you're looking at an application about what you're concerned about, and you're spinning it a little bit from what the discussion that we're having here, because you're spinning it to hey, if you're concerned about it, you should probably be logging that, right? Or you should be at least alerting on it. And you did tie into something that I wanted to ask. You said that you don't see good examples, right? Or that's I guess that's how I took it of logging. Or do you see people doing that correctly, or is it something that falls down, or where are you at there?
You broke up at the very beginning of that question. I caught the end of it. Specifically, you said log examples, or what were you asking about there?
Oh, yeah. So do you have any? You don't have to name customers or people that you've worked with in the past, whatever. But can you give us an example of where someone has messed up in the past and how that came to light?
Yeah. So. There's a couple different places. There's some very, very basic ones that people that are in either SREs or DevOps users who have dealt with any sort of proxy logs. One of the very clear and obvious ones is when you're looking at authentication logs, all these authentications appear like they're coming from an internal IP address, but it's because they're one hop down from the edge load balancer or something, and you're logging the incorrect information. So when you say, show me where user Justin Massey logged in from, you actually don't know where he logged in his IP address from. So you can't do any sort of, correlation. Is this normal, or, does he log in from a different country he's normally logged in from? So that's one place that's, I think a lot of applications are not logging that correctly. Another example, and the reason you would have found that is because you would have asked a question, been like, where did Justin log in from? And then you ask the logs, you ask your logging product to spit out that answer, and you get bad information. So that's how you find that one.
Okay.
Another one is, say, I've seen where that you have different login mechanisms to access your application. So if you think of, you just can log in with username and password, that's one authentication mechanism. Another one maybe that you support OAuth, and another is SAML. So you have these different authentication mechanisms, and I've seen where the authentication mechanisms use different logs. So in one mechanism, you may log the username and IP address, and the other one, you just log the IP address. So you find that because you're searching for, say, once again, we'll take the example, Justin Massey logged in with, maybe he logged in with the password and he logged in with SAML at different times. And you ask the question of show me all the IP addresses, and one of them maybe didn't have it. And you usually find those not at a good point in time. You find those when you're doing the analytics, doing some security investigation, then you find out you don't have that data.
Okay.
So that's typically when you find them. But those are two examples of things you don't know are wrong until you need them.
Yeah. Yeah. And this actually, I've been involved in the actually within the last couple of weeks with a security incident where they're having some issues with authentication. And one piece is that they're sending out like emails, like unlock and reset password emails through a third-party provider. And they've identified a huge gap because the provider by themselves, the logging that they have, like they just roll it over like every like 15 days or something like that. And they don't report on what's going through. And I know like, from a strict storage perspective, that's probably, that's a gap that they're going to have to close to figure that out. But I did want to switch over to Ken. I know like you, when you're doing analysis of apps at GitHub, are you also like, what is your strategy for logging and recommending audit logs to developers? Right? Do you guys have like a central like Splunk instance or something like that? I guess we don't need to dig into tech, but you have a central log repository that you do that? Are you using third-party providers? Like, what's your paved path, for lack of a better term, for logging?
Yeah, so anything that hits like a load balancer does have I guess SIM or Steam or however you would say it. I don't want to say the technology, but it's you make queries on it. So yeah. Anyway, so that takes all the traffic that hits the load balancer, so any web traffic. But then for like specifically for a logging service for the application to send events off to, anytime it's a CRUD operation, that's usually when we're like, okay, we want to know who did that. And, like at what time, like all those kind of details that you want to know. But anything that might be like security impacting too, and I'm trying to get like non-specific, but specific. So I had this, like I said, I just finished an assessment with another coworker. We were concerned about how connections were established because it's requiring two separate identities, essentially, that you're merging into one and calling it a subscription. So that obviously those transactions, how you set that up, we want to like get specific information from that. And then the other things that were of interest were anytime a message was sent that might have private repository data, right? I don't really like public repository data. Cool, whatever. Not so interesting though. Private stuff is our main like concern always. So we want to know if you have sent a message that does have some innocuous details, at least at first glance, about some private, like the title of an issue or like who was the owner of that issue, who was the last person that commented on it. I don't necessarily need to know all of those details, but I need to know what issue by the identifier in what repository. Those types of things are very specific to us, but I need to know what those, because going back, it's important to, if there's a mistake in the query, and let's say we've accidentally written the query wrong for a lookup on that subscription I mentioned before, where you have two separate identities. If our query's messed up and we accidentally leak the names of a private repository's issue or something like that off to another person, I absolutely have to know that, because it could be 6 months down the line and it could be something that only happens once in a while. But if we're going to go back and notify people or see if we need to notify people, we have to have that information. So we don't want to get so specific that we're giving all, like basically storing all of the private issues and everything that's going on in them. But there are certain things we need to be able to trace back. So it's very much kind of what you kind of said, where like it's the AAA or or like the triad or whatever, but it's also got the business critical stuff that you need to log, I guess. Okay. What I don't understand though, this is actually something I still don't really necessarily know. Like two things. How do you notify? And like if you need an immediate notification, what is like an immediate notification. Does that make sense? Like, for instance, if all of a sudden your root account, like you had mentioned, Justin, your root account for AWS is used, no two-factor auth, and they just logged into AWS and that doesn't happen. Like, who do you notify? Or how does that, what's the recommended approach for notifying? And like, was that this type of severity of event that you want to send a notification off to somebody like immediately to react on?
Yeah, so I think you have to take it at, for us, a customer by customer basis, or if you are the customer, how do you do your typical workflow? Or do you work in Slack? If you work in Slack and your developers, your security team has like a SecOps channel, well, if people are responding there, send it to there. If it's, if you use PagerDuty and you think this is an alert that needs to go to someone that's on your PagerDuty rotation, send it to them on PagerDuty. So you can come up with those workflows for things that are like, immediate, like right now. Imagine you open a security group to the world, like a user does this. That may not be something you want to immediately page, your on-call PagerDuty person for, but that may be something that you want to have some sort of, you may want to message that developer on Slack and say, hey, did you just do this? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then good. But if the answer is no, it could mean that his developer thing, is compromised, right? So his developer credentials are compromised for AWS or whatever it was you're using. So there's different levels, right? Like how important the severity is. You have to take into account what tools you're using and what in security, we're always talking about, like DevSecOps, let's integrate into the developer's tooling. So let's make sure that we're using what the developers use and work in that same workflow. So you don't want to introduce a new tool. No one wants another dashboard to log into. No one wants another thing, another username and password they have to remember. So working in developer workflow is really important. And then it comes back to like threat modeling, what you actually want to alert on.
So don't work outside of what's already established for like the communication channels that developers are using when like a database goes out and they need to get alerted. Kind of sounds like what's funny is I can't remember his name, but there was a talk at I think it was a DevOps or LastCon at one point. He worked for Slack at the time, doesn't anymore, but he was saying that that's what they do. They would send a notification, like you said, over Slack to say, did you do this? And then you had to respond and then also require two-factor auth to make sure that if your chat ops got compromised or whatever, like you had a second form of two-factor authentication to say, I am who I am and I do approve this action. I don't know. Maybe that risk tolerance is okay for them. I'm not sure if it's okay for everyone, but I mean, it seems pretty like a good way to do it, I guess. Seth, what do you think about that? Out of curiosity, would you be okay with that? Like, if you saw something that was potentially of interest, and you sent them a message over Slack, and they said yes, and then hit let's say Duo, and they sent me a push, accepted it, approved it. Would that be enough for you? Or given that you consult with so many different companies, I imagine some companies are okay with that and others aren't.
Yeah, it's gonna depend on their own kind of risk tolerance there. And honestly, I'm pretty flexible when it comes to that, especially if we have the data available to us. Right? That's typically the problem that I run into, is exactly what Justin was saying before. All the logins look like they're coming from the same IP address, right? Because it's proxied. That kind of thing I run into way more often than, hey, we're reporting and aren't quite sure how to monitor something. I do see gaps in that, but it's typically solved more by tuning the SIM or, actually, taking some of those items and identifying those patterns and bringing them to the forefront, as opposed to, hey, we're really concerned about the data that's in there and who has access to it, that kind of thing, right? That like, I feel like that's a much easier solved problem than, dang, we have to go back to the code and actually start logging this data. So, I mean, that's just, my opinion on it. But
I did want to bring up, and actually, now it's covering your entire face, Justin. I apologize. There's got to be a better way for that to, sorry. That's got to be. So the question is, we'll just read it off. Do libraries and frameworks tend to, and this is Alex Lauerman, by the way, he's a friend. Do libraries and frameworks tend to natively log, or do you have to explicitly log these events? For example, if you want to notify an excess API activity, does that tend to require code changes? So that's quite a lengthy question. I think the first part, I don't know if you want to take a stab about, do frameworks and libraries tend to natively log? Justin, I mean, I don't know if you want to take a stab at that. I certainly know Seth and I have some thoughts on that, but yeah.
It depends on framework. I mean, it's going to be very framework dependent. Like if you're looking at something simple like Python Flask is going to log things. Say you're using, if you're just serving a simple API, it's going to log things like this IP address, from just made this HTTP method request to this endpoint, and this was the status code. It's going to give you that sort of information out of the box, which is great and helpful. But down deeper in the application, once you start customizing it, you're not going to have things like the user logged in. Like that's not going to be in the basic Python Flask. Now, if you look at something like Django, you're going to get more information like that. That's a more full, more full application stack. But it's not. A lot of times, it's not going to take into account things like that upstream proxy. So yes, certain frameworks are going to give you more information than others. I think when you're looking at HTTP frameworks, they're going to give you the basics, but not give you the in detail information about your custom application. I won't take the second part yet. I'll turn that over to you, Seth.
No, I'd agree. That's typically what I say. I know we use Django as like one of our test code review bases, right? And like I'd almost argue it's like their web server logs do a pretty good job, right? Like, and Flask is the same way. Like they show the post request, they show that there was a GET request, and then the error log or whatever else will spit out a bunch of like debug information. But that link in the middle is always the question, right? What are you concerned about with your application? And are those logs sufficient in showing, hey, this user did something that changed data, or they accessed a portion of the application that maybe they shouldn't have, right? Like you don't get that context. And with logging, context is everything, right? Like if you can't tie those pieces all together, it becomes very difficult to actually say what happened, right? And that, I mean, I think that's what you're tying to. So yeah, Ken, any thoughts on your end on that?
Man, I was just thinking we need a term for like stuff like Node and Express and Python and Flask and Sinatra and Ruby, where it's like a skeleton bare bones version of a web server versus like the Rails Django, and at one point it was Getty. I don't know if Node ever like had a more. I've heard a few thrown out that are like more MVC, more fully packaged. But like, I do think we need like to separate those out because there are two separate. Because we talk about this in the course too. We're like, if you've got Django or if you've got Rails or if you've got one of these bigger frameworks, like an entire framework, it already handles CSRF. It already has like in your settings usually configuration options for how you want to log. Like if you want to, what level do you want to log at, right? Like a debug, because typically debug, warn, info, error. Those are the like 4 different methods that most of the logging libraries seem to provide. And then based off the configuration setting is like how it'll log, right? Well, the more fully featured frameworks, they have all this stuff like CSRF protection, proper logging settings, all this stuff right out of the box. Whereas like every time I come across a review of something like like Golang and Mux, or like I said, Node and Express. I already know now I have to do the extra work to make sure that all of the security features that I would typically want and would be packaged into these bigger frameworks are like in these like piecemeal skeleton sort of wannabe frameworks, but not really. It's just like a web server type deal. You know what I mean? Like not a whole lot comes with it. So like whether it's logging or whether it's CSRF protection or whether it's like, I don't know, secure headers or whatever, usually they lack if it's not a fully featured framework is basically where I would go with that. And then separately, that's frameworks. And then just real quick, separately for libraries, each library has its own sort of way of doing things, right? Like if you have an authentication or authorization library, it may have pretty easy to configure options for logging, or it may have none. Like it really does. I guess it goes back to just like, what are you using? And yeah, your expectations sort of have to be tempered based off of your framework choice, I guess is what I would say there.
I want to add one thing in here. Seth, you mentioned context, and Ken, you mentioned using these different libraries to that may do logging inside of whatever framework you're using. If you look at say 2 log lines from the same application, same service, say it's a Python Flask application, you have 2 log lines. Can you tie those 2 log lines together if they're related? So say a user logs in, you see the HTTP request, and then the next login, so maybe it was an HTTP post request to log in. The next log line you see is Justin Massey logged in. Can you see that those 2 are linked? And a lot of times the answer is no, because that in that first log line, it included a lot of information for you. It included the HTTP user agent. It included the IP address. In your subsequent log line, you may not have logged those 2 pieces of information. So how do you tie those together?
Yeah.
Even more so, you want to go upstream to one layer up to that proxy service we've been talking about. How do you tie those logs together? Like you should be able to type in some sort of often in HTTP as a request ID. You want to type in a request ID and see it through the entire stack, all the way down to your database layer, so you can see everything that was done. So that's going to give you that context when you're going to look into, say, a specific maybe exploit, or you need to go back and do some investigation. That request ID is going to be able to give you that context, and without it, man, you're paddling upriver without a paddle.
Yeah, you're screwed. So I have a story specifically around that, because I started my security career at a bank, right? And one of the pieces that we were putting into place was a logging infrastructure and monitoring for all of their member activity as they were logging in. They had just developed their website. I mean, so it dates me, right? Back in the early 2000s. And they had built, the developers, as they were trying to speed up development, had built a proxy to talk to the mainframe to do things like check balances, transfer money and everything like that. But the proxy itself, the way that it worked, the web application would make a request to the proxy would make it to the mainframe, but there was no, exactly what you're saying, there was no request ID. They didn't pass back the user or the account from the proxy, from the web server to the proxy. It was just this whole trusted communication chain. And they started having issues where money ended up in the wrong account, and they couldn't figure out why it happened or who had requested it or who had done it. So one of the first huge projects that we had at the bank was exactly what you were saying. Hey, we've got the load balancers on the front end. They have a request ID. That's got to be passed back to the web servers, which has to be passed back to the application. And every step in this chain has to log that request ID with anything that goes along with it. And it was a multi-year effort to make that happen. Just based on the technology that was being used, it was not as simple as just, there's one log statement here and everything's using the same logging mechanism. It's a hard problem to solve. And they were just up at night, right? They had no answer for it for a long time. And so the second that like the SOX auditors and other people were coming in, like they had this huge plan that they had to explain, this is what's happening. We're trying to solve it. We'll get there. And I mean, eventually they did, but that was the whole issue. Same thing. So it's interesting that you should bring that up because I've seen it, for the past 2 decades, right? At this point, it still happens.
Yeah, it's not it still happens because it's not really an easy problem to solve and it's not out of the box. So people actually have to know to go do it. Yeah. And we talk about it from the investigation side, but one thing I've looked at recently is using it for detection side. Uh-huh. And so if you look at like an application, your application, if it's on the internet, it's under attack, all the time, right? Like people are going to be hitting it with scanners. So if you look at a popular, Burp Suite, popular tool, right? Like there are some things you can look at in the HTTP request to see if an attacker is coming from, say, Burp Suite. You can look at the HTTP user agent headers, and if they're running a scan on you, you're going to see something along the lines of port swigger. Now, you don't want to, alert anyone and wake up your SOC or any of your team if you see an attack going on, just from that user agent header. But what I've been toying with and is looking at what do you want to do if you see a user agent in that upstream proxy log, and that user has made an authenticating request to your application. So you have someone who maybe set up a trial account and is testing your application on a trial account, so some sort of bug bounty person maybe, or it could be a targeted attack, via nation state, or it could be a mischievous person that has access to your application that's just that maybe you don't have trials, but they are authenticated to your application somehow, and they are scanning your application. What do you like if you detect an attack? Like a user that's running, say, Burp Suite from an authenticated user, because you're able to join those queries together because you have the upstream proxy and your application logs, you can detect that. What do you do next? Is a really interesting something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Yeah. So is the question, just to rewrap that up, is are you trying to? So you've got so that they're scanning you, and they're scanning you in an authenticated way. Is there more danger? Are you saying there's more danger because they're authenticated, or?
Yeah, well, like it's going to be by customer basis. I know that. Like everyone's going to have a different threat model. Like if you have trial accounts, then you're going to be more subject to this. But if you don't have trial accounts, if you have, say, if it's an internal application that's being scanned with this is a completely different threat. Is how to where is,
especially if it's a privileged account.
Right. Yeah. So like level of access, but tying these together, I think is really interesting. And I haven't exactly figured out how to make it super useful yet, but it's something I've been looking at a lot lately.
That actually I could see there's definitely some areas for us that like some specific, it's not just that they're authenticated, but there's certainly some role levels and actor types that would be of interest if they were scanning. And also if they hit, for like us, we actually have a SSRF target for our bounty. And when people are able to hit it, 2 things happen. One, they get a unique identifier back, and then they can give us to that, and we can kind of just say, okay, we have enough data and you've got this unique value. This makes sense. This has to be you, right? The second thing that happens is an actual high level, high emergency alert sort of thing, is sent out. Right. I think we even get a chat ops notification about it if someone hits that SSRF target through our infrastructure, basically, or even maybe at all. Like I can't remember exactly, but so like that's one area where if we saw, the reason I bring that up is because the burp can be configured to have collaborator settings where it can do those SSRF. So like if it sees a DNS request or it sees an HTTPS request off to whatever you configured as the server for burp collaborator, it'll go off and if it gets a notification, burp collaborator sends back information to your scanner that like this looks like it actually works and you might actually have SSRF. So they can configure that to be our target. And I think that in that case would be something like, that's just an example of something I think that would be pretty serious for us from a scanning perspective. But also, like you had mentioned, maybe there's definitely some role types and actor types that would be definitely of interest if people are scanning with that. Oh, and also I wanted to kind of wrap back around because Ken Toller's original question was he had a question on what's your take on what to log versus what to monitor. In other words, are you a fan of log everything and analyze later, or log what you need so you can maximize things like storage and efficiency? Totally have you answer that, but I think you sort of alluded to that a little bit when you were discussing like the idea of tying events together, like collecting the data, but then making those connections as to what might be of interest by tying events together. But anyways, I'll let you answer that question.
I think like logging everything is, that's a lot. Like Seth and I were talking about this on the pre-show. Like some developers will just log everything in debugs. You're going to find a lot of stuff. So like, I don't necessarily think you need to log everything, but you want to log everything that you need to make these, to answer certain questions. You should choose, when you're choosing your logging solution, you should choose a solution that's like storage is cheap. Like keeping this stuff maybe in memory may not be cheap, but the storage of this and the retention of this is cheap. Like, so you should choose a solution that's going to be able to, store this at a cost that's realistic for your company to have an appetite to pay for that. So I would keep that in mind. Like storage has gotten a lot cheaper in the last several years. So I think we have to think about that less. Like now the question is, do you keep something for 6 months versus 2 years? I mean, that's a different, that's a different question. If you want to go on the notion of like, breaches, this mean time to detect a breach a while back was like 15 months. I think it's gone down now, but like, do you keep things for that long? But that's where I would start is like, I would log everything you think you're going to need because storage is cheap, and just make sure your solution, I mean, you could store things in S3 or Glacier and keep them forever, and then, run Athena queries on them if you need them, right? So just whatever logging solution you choose, keep that in mind.
I'd like to add to that real quick that I 100% have experienced situations, plural, where we needed more than 2 years to go back on, where a bug kind of sat around. Believe it or not, bugs, I mean, I'm saying this not to the three of us, but to everybody listening. Believe it or not, bugs can sit around for a while undetected. I mean, that sounds obvious, but it's not as obvious as you'd think. There's sometimes some flaws that you're like, how did this go undetected for a while? And it's just the nature of writing a lot of code and a lot of code churn and a lot of a lot of code. That's really what it comes down to. When you deal with so much code, there's bound to be bugs that stick around for a while. And when you want to go back and, like I said, do I need to tell people that their account had some stuff that was leaked or something like that? Like, I need multiple years of data sometimes. It's definitely happened in multiple instances. Just in the almost 3 years at GitHub that I've been there, that there's been a need for that. But before that, even at Living Social, like anytime I've done Blue Team, you need more than 6 months does not cut it of logs, in my opinion. That's just my opinion, but I don't think that even comes close to cutting it. So, and if storage is cheap, then why not? Yeah. Seth, what do you think, man? You're quiet. What's up?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that again, the issue that I see stepping into most of the clients is just are just the basics that we talked about at the beginning, right? Is like, I know large institutions have this figured out, but I even know startups that struggle with this question. Like, yes, they want to store things, but then the second that they start talking, and I want to get to this because I know, Justin, you brought up some of the tagging and the other stuff that you're doing in the cloud environments, but I know this is a huge problem, is they just don't understand. Like, they may be able to tell you who logged into the application at what time, but they may not have a good feeling on, all right, it came in through AWS, through CloudTrail, through this Lambda or whatever, in order to get to the application, which is a huge piece of the picture. And so that's what I wanted to kind of to jump into here was like you've been doing like analytics on application logs, right? Some of the credential stuffing stuff that you've been talking about, and then also like logging detection in the cloud. Can you talk to both of those, like, and how you're actually going about that, like what those analytics are on that side of things, and then also, hey, what are you doing in the cloud? How are you aggregating that data together? Like, are there any good places that we can look there for, like, giving recommendations to people?
So the first one's on analytics. One thing I recommend doing is mapping everything to a set, like what Datadog we call standard attributes. Other logging providers call them different things. So basically, it's distilling or normalizing a client IP address. So, like, in your Nginx logs, your IP may be called client IP. Another thing, it may be called a network client IP. Normalizing all of those on a set of attributes, and being able to do analytics on those. So, like, looking at, like, say, show me what my top IPs talking to me are, and then grouping it by, say, show me like the top IPs for, and then give me show me by like source what sources are sending IP addresses. Because if you see like your Nginx logs are sending you IPs, but you aren't seeing them from like your HA proxy logs, for example. Like, being able to do analytics on that and quickly see that you're not getting them from that source is really important. Because you want to be able to search that IP address across all those different sources, whether it's from AWS or whether it's from your application. You want to be able to search that IP in one place.
Yeah. So you're saying using the analytics and the logs that you have to identify where you've got gaps. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, identify where you have gaps, and then when you're doing your investigation, hopefully you won't have gaps. And you can use, we build dashboards to visualize all of your data in one dashboard. So you can show your Nginx logs right next to your Apache logs, right next to your CloudTrail logs, and you can, maybe this is like an IP overview dashboard, and you filter on your IP address, and boom, you can quickly see this IP address has logged into AWS, this specific account, and it has also made requests to this log. It's doing like log analytics. I don't like the word security analytics, that phrase. I don't necessarily know if people know what it means. I don't think the industry has like come across a common term that they know exactly what security analytics means. Maybe this is what it is. But to me, it's log analytics, because you're looking at the underlying logs, and they're just security events coming from there. So I want to filter down all those things, and then because you've mapped things, so maybe all of your authentications for your custom application are extracted, so you can see things like this was an authentication method, and they logged in with SAML. You can show all of those things in that dashboard, right next to all of your other sources of data. So once you've normalized it and doing the analytics on it, it allows you to get a really quick glance at what maybe an IP address is doing.
Okay. Are the attributes configurable? So because you talked about cataloging. So the attributes is that sort of just like arbitrary metadata that you can add to your logging, and then you like if I wanted to just put like, I don't know, tag something as Seth Law is hacking or something, I don't know, whatever. Like, I would just be able to add arbitrary data to the logging and then perform my analysis and aggregation.
Yeah. So for us, for tagging, we tag, like, say you're running instances or VMs or something. There's metadata on that instance in VM that your ops team has probably already put on there. So it's tagged by default if you're in Amazon with an EC2 instance ID, and GCP, it's the VM the VM ID and or the compute ID. I don't actually forget what GCP calls it. Anyway, but then also you've added additional metadata. So you may say this is team, this is your SRE team, or this is your security team, and you have additional context on that instance. So when we collect logs from there, we tag all of those logs with that additional context. So if you want to search for the logs that were on that instance, you just click boom, click on that instance ID, and you can search that instance. Or you want to show all of your SRE logs, you can just click on instance on your SRE tag and search down. That's where, like, that additional context helps you filter on those things, on those specific infrastructure tags. For, like, logs themselves, we recommend tagging on, like, the source. So this was like a source of Nginx or source of HA proxy. Those are like additional, like, log attributes. But we really think that the contextual information about where those logs came from is really important, and who those logs are associated with.
Yeah. And I know, like, not specific to Datadog, but I know, like, Splunk, when you start talking about the importers and how they, that's kind of built in, that tagging to their infrastructure is, it's coming from this specific source, and you have to give it all right, this is Nginx, or this is, this system as it's on its way in. So some of that's built into it, but it's like, that's one thing that I don't know if I've done a deep dive in on the cloud side of things. So it's interesting to hear how that actually works. So, I mean, specific to, like, AWS, is that just included? Like, if you throw those tags onto a specific instance ID or something, or an instance, right? Does that automatically get included in the CloudTrail logs, or is there something special you need to do? Well,
these aren't necessarily in the CloudTrail logs. They're available to the instance. So we're all familiar with the instance metadata service. You query 169, 259, and you can get the credentials from that. But what you could also get are the associated attributes to that server. So you've attached a team attribute, a team tag. Those are also available in that instance metadata. So when Datadog goes and collects logs, so you can install, like, an agent to collect logs on that machine, we will query that instance metadata service to get the tags, so we can tag your data when we send them up. So we're not getting them from the CloudTrail log. The CloudTrail log is only going to, for, say, an instance, it's only going to log any control plane activity. So if your instance is granted IAM permissions to access an S3 bucket, and you want to make the call list buckets, which is not very dangerous. It can be a misused API call, because if an attacker has access to your instance, the first thing he wants to know is to give me all the buckets that I have access to, right?
Yeah.
So he's going to run those buckets. That API call is going to end up in CloudTrail, and it's going to say, it's going to have a session identifier associated with it, and that session identifier is going to be the instance ID.
Okay.
It's not going to have any of the tags associated with that instance ID, but you're going to have the instance ID, so you can go back and look, this instance ID made a list buckets call.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that actually calls back to, Ken Toller just asked another question, right? About how you build out logging requirements. So this fits right in with what we're talking about, right? Like, do you add logging requirements for engineering teams as outputs of threat models, or recommendations and finding retrospectives? Like, how do you push those down? And this might be specific more to an internal team like Ken's, as opposed to, Datadog. If you're dealing with customers, that's kind of going to be whatever they give you, correct?
Yeah. If the customer, what I commonly recommend, if it's an existing application, is that if you have a security team and they're doing these things like threat hunting, if you like write down all the places that you don't have logs. What logs do you not have in those applications? A lot of threat hunting goes across over like your ADR tool, your networks tool. But I'm saying like look at specifically your application, ask questions about your application, and see if you can answer those with your logs. So then you can go inform your developers that they don't have those. But if you're doing like a greenfield application, I don't necessarily know where like a good place. Like I don't even know if there's any great website blog posts on that. So maybe that's a topic one of us can write about.
Yeah.
But I would go and look at like your major cloud providers like AWS and GCP and see what they're logging and how they're logging and build your requirements based on that, because they and even at GitHub y'all have an audit log that you give your customers, so the customers can query your audit log. So take a look at those logs and take inspiration from those. But I don't know who asked the question, but I don't have a great documentation to point you to.
Yeah. And I think Ken's question, and he can clarify, or he can ask later if he wants this as well. But I think it was more of, are you building out the logging requirements at the beginning of the SDLC, or are you waiting until after to provide those recommendations and figure out what those logging requirements are? I know I have my own prejudices here. Like I would rather see someone build the logging out as they're building the application, because they're going to be in it and they'll think about threats as they're going along, as opposed to, hey, we identified a gap 6 months down the road and now we're 6 months behind, right? I think that's probably going to be best practice, unless somebody agrees with me or disagrees with me, I guess I should say.
I can give you a kind of a recent-ish example. I mean, now it's pretty public that GitHub has the code spaces where you've got your VS Code online, essentially, right?
Yeah. In
GitHub.com. Well, during the design discussions for that, which are ongoing but lengthy, and there's like do a little design to implement, go over the hurdles, do a security review, go back to the next step, and that's sort of how it's gone. But even from the very beginning, they were very easy to think about items to log. So even during that discussion, when we go through the proposed architecture, we talk, again, it's not super formal threat model. It's just sort of like, all right, I've been doing this long enough, so here are some things that seem like you might want to think about this, think about that, maybe tweak this. That's the point at which I definitely gave some advice, and you would give some advice on what items to log for sure, because there's definitely, again, you're talking about two separate services with two separate identities for you and tying those together. Anytime you do that, it's fraught with peril. You need to log very specific things, right? But during the review, there's going to be all the little implementation details. That's all pie in the sky, high level, way looking at it from a high level view. But when you get into the implementation details, then you're talking about those CRUD operations I mentioned earlier. And you're talking about all these little things that you're like, oh, these are all these little things that sort of tasks that have to be accomplished. And that's where you get into the more specifics, I think, of like, okay, we're missing logging on this, we're missing logging on that. I didn't even know this was going to be a thing, but log that, and again, back to what Justin said, is you want to make sure that you tie several pieces of data together, because again, especially in an instance where you have two different identity providers, yeah. So anyways, that's kind of, I don't know if is that succinct enough? I don't know. Does that make sense, Seth, at all?
Yeah. Yeah. So
not,
you were building out the requirements in kind of each phase of each sprint, right? Like you were talking about some sort of requirements and having them implement them as you go.
Yeah, you can think about it's easy to think about some very specific things, but it's just like you're not going to know every single little implementation detail before it's coded up. So then you have to go back after it's coded up and then also be like, oh yeah, I didn't think about this, that, or the other. You just can't predict everything, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I definitely make it, it's definitely a requirement. I mean, and I think you and I, Seth, we've talked about this so much. We have a whole section that's dedicated, a whole part of our day with exercises on just auditing, because that's how important it is. So have an idea before you get into the design discussion and threat modeling is what I would say.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So,
and then
I mean,
I did want to mention, but real quick on the like Kyle Rippey for the cloud frameworks versus MVC frameworks, I don't, or maybe microservice versus monolith frame. I almost want to make it like bare bone versus fully featured or something. I don't know what to call it, but we do need a term for it.
There you go. Go ahead and coin something.
We got to make up some terms or something. Yeah.
I like the term hipster framework, but that's just me. So, yeah.
But it's not. But you could argue that Mux and Golang is hipster, and so is Rails, right?
Yeah.
Although Rails is now kind of like, I think Rails is now the boomer technology, which we have a guest coming that's going to talk about that. But yeah. It's like skeleton versus
fully featured. Yeah,
something like that. So,
anyways, yeah. Well,
actually, I have to be rolling here soon.
Yeah, I mean, we've been going for an hour. We don't want to Justin. Thank you so much for joining us today. Right, like this has been a very informative discussion. Right, and I know there's a lot to talk about and unpack when it comes to logging. So we appreciate you giving your time to it. Any recommendations for reading or blog posts that you have to get someone started in that space?
There's a couple different things. I mean, I think all the major like Clint Gibler's TLDR sec is always a good place. He has a section in there for AppSec. Any sort of news feeds, just stay up to date on what's going on and read the latest breaches and like how if they're affected like the application security of those companies. I write a blog post on behalf of Datadog with our fantastic writing team, and we have one on GCP that we've written. There will be more coming out. We do our best to make those as informative as possible to keep you, so that you go away like really learning some detailed information. So keep an eye out for additional blog posts upcoming on that. But that's, I would say there's a lot of really good people on the internet curating content right now, and I would pay attention to those.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot going on.
I do want to say real.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. I also just want to real quick thank Datadog for your time, because they're the ones who allowed us to take your time up in the middle of the day like this. So thank you to Datadog for that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we really do appreciate it. I think that's the blog post. I just linked it there, so people could take a look at it. And again, right, like I think the more information that people have on it and actually think about their application to log the important data is realistically where they should start. And at some point we could get together and I'll do some sort of a blog post or cheat sheet about it. I know we could, but Justin, where can people find you if they have further questions? Like what avenues do you typically respond to?
Twitter, jmassey09 is my Twitter handle. That's probably the easiest to reach me at. It's I'd say jmassey09 on Twitter.
Oh, okay. Yep. We'll link it in the show notes and with the episode itself. As far as last minute items, again, if you've got further questions, feel free to hit us up on Twitter or join our Slack channel, or absoluteappsec.com has the link to join Slack. And I don't think I've got anything else right now. Ken, any final thoughts before we call it for today?
No, just that if I had known Justin was an ultra marathoner before, I just noticed that I would have had other questions as well. But that's
all
awesome.
AppSec related, I'm sure, right? Yeah.
None AppSec related. But yeah, that's awesome. That's so extreme, ultra marathoning. It's I only heard about it. Sounds extreme. Anyways, that's like we don't want to get off topic, but that's really awesome.
Cool. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for joining today. Thanks for the questions, and we'll see everyone next week.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.